It came through back channels, not a press release, not a tweet, not a formal diplomatic note handed over at the United Nations. It came the way the most dangerous messages always come, quietly, deliberately, and with the weight of something that cannot be taken back. Tehran had a message for Donald Trump, and that message was simple. Stop the war in Lebanon. Stop it now. Or Israel burns, and this time, there will be no warning before the missiles fly. That single communication, relayed through Omani intermediaries in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, changed the calculus of every government on earth. Because this wasn't bluster. This wasn't the usual Iranian rhetoric designed for domestic consumption. This was an ultimatum with a deadline, delivered by a regime that had already proven, twice in the previous 18 months, that it was willing to fire hundreds of ballistic missiles at a sovereign nation and absorb the consequences. The question hanging over every intelligence briefing in Washington, Jerusalem, and Riyadh wasn't whether Tehran meant it. The question was whether anyone could stop what was already in motion. To understand how we got here, you have to go back, not just months, but years. The enmity between Iran and Israel is not a recent invention. It is a decades-long Cold War punctuated by proxy violence, covert assassinations, cyber attacks, and the slow, grinding accumulation of grievances that eventually reach critical mass. But the specific chain of events that led to this moment began accelerating in the spring of the previous year, when Israeli airstrikes on Iranian military advisors embedded with Syrian forces killed 23 personnel, including 2 senior Revolutionary Guard commanders. Tehran retaliated with a drone missile barrage, 331 projectiles launched in a single night, of which Israeli and allied defenses intercepted 97%. The world exhaled. Analysts called it a managed escalation. A message sent without a catastrophe triggered. They were wrong about the managed part. Israel's response to that barrage was surgical but unmistakable, a strike on an S-300 radar installation near Isfahan, a signal that the Iron Dome wasn't the only thing Israel was willing to deploy. And then Hezbollah, watching from the north, watching from Lebanon's southern hills where they had spent 20 years building fortified tunnels and stockpiling an estimated 150,000 rockets, began their own escalation. Rocket barrages into the Galilee. Drone strikes on Kiryat Shmona. Anti-tank missiles that killed 4 Israeli soldiers in a single ambush near Mechola. Israel responded with airstrikes on Hezbollah logistics hubs in the Bekaa Valley. Then Beirut's southern suburbs. Then the strikes that killed 2 Hezbollah commanders whose names had been on Israeli target lists for over a decade. By the time the war in Lebanon reached full intensity, the casualty figures were staggering. In 6 months of fighting along the northern border, Israel had lost 312 soldiers and 89 civilians. Lebanese civilian casualties had surpassed 4,200, a number that the international community condemned in increasingly urgent terms and that Israel's government described, without apology, as the unavoidable cost of dismantling a terrorist infrastructure deliberately embedded in residential neighborhoods. Hezbollah's losses were harder to verify, but Western intelligence estimates put their battlefield dead at somewhere between 1,800 and 2,400 fighters, a serious blow to an organization that had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of war. And through all of it, Iran watched. Iran funded. Iran supplied. The Shahed 136 loitering munitions that struck Israeli forward positions near the border, those came from Iranian factories. The Fateh 110 short-range ballistic missiles that Hezbollah fired at Haifa, killing 11 people in a residential neighborhood on a Wednesday afternoon, those came from Iranian stockpiles. Tehran was not a bystander in Lebanon's war. Tehran was the engine. And Israel knew it. And Israel said so, publicly, repeatedly, with the kind of directness that diplomats usually spend careers trying to avoid. So when the Omani channel delivered Tehran's warning to Trump's national security team, it did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived at the end of a chain of escalation that had already cost thousands of lives, that had already drawn American carrier groups into the eastern Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, that had already pushed oil prices past $127 a barrel and sent financial markets into the kind of convulsive anxiety that central bankers lose sleep over. The warning arrived in a world that was already teetering. Here is what was said, as best as can be reconstructed from multiple sourced accounts. The Iranian message was delivered in 3 parts. First, The Islamic Republic of Iran holds the United States directly responsible for enabling Israeli military operations in Lebanon through the continued supply of weapons, intelligence, and diplomatic cover. Second, if Israeli military operations in Lebanon do not cease within a defined window, the specific timeframe has been reported variously as 72 hours and 96 hours, Iran will conduct direct military strikes against Israeli territory without prior notification or diplomatic warning. Third, any American military response to those Iranian strikes will be treated as an act of war against Iran, and the Strait of Hormuz will be closed. That last part. Think about what that means. 17 million barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That is roughly 20% of global oil consumption, transiting through a waterway that is, at its narrowest point, 21 miles wide. Iran has spent 30 years developing the capability to close that strait: anti-ship missiles, naval mines, fast attack boats, shore-based artillery, submarines. Closing the strait wouldn't just hurt Israel. It would hurt every economy on Earth. It would hurt China, which imports more Gulf oil than anyone. It would hurt Europe, already fragile. It would send the American economy into a recession that no Federal Reserve policy could quickly reverse. That threat was not an accident. It was the most precise and devastating card Tehran could play, and they played it deliberately. The White House's initial response was, and this is the word multiple sources used, stunned silence. Not because anyone doubted Iranian capability, but because the directness of the ultimatum, the specificity of the threat, and the involvement of the strait represented a qualitative escalation beyond anything Tehran had previously communicated. Trump was briefed at 6:47 in the morning. His first public statement came 4 hours later, and it was vintage Trump, defiant, combative, and carefully ambiguous about exactly what the United States would do. He said, and I'm quoting as closely as the public record allows, Iran knows what will happen to them if they make a very big mistake. We have the most powerful military in the world, and we're not afraid to use it. He said the word catastrophic twice. He did not say what specifically the United States would do if Iran struck Israel. He did not announce new deployments. He did not pick up the phone to Bibi Netanyahu on a public call. And that silence, that deliberate, calculated ambiguity, was itself a message. It meant the back-channel conversations were happening at a level and intensity that made public statements almost irrelevant. And here's where I want to ask you something, because I think it's a question that doesn't have an easy answer. If you were sitting in Trump's chair at that moment, what would you do? You've got an Iranian ultimatum with a countdown clock. You've got an Israeli government that is not going to stop its Lebanon operation, not for Iran, not for the United States, not for anyone. You've got American sailors on ships in the Gulf and the Mediterranean who are now potential targets. You've got an election-sensitive public that is exhausted by foreign wars. What's the move? Because I genuinely think reasonable people disagree on this, and I think the disagreement tells us something important about what America is right now. The deadline passed. Israel did not stop its operations in Lebanon. The Lebanese town of Qiyam was struck by Israeli airstrikes on the final night of the ultimatum window, killing 34 people, including 8 Hezbollah fighters and 26 civilians. The images were broadcast globally. And at 3:14 in the morning, local time, air raid sirens began sounding across northern Israel, across the Golan Heights, across Haifa and Acre and Tiberias. They were followed, within minutes, by the distinctive thunder of Iron Dome interceptors launching from their batteries. Then the deeper, more resonant detonations of Arrow 3 systems engaging targets at higher altitude. And then the impacts, not all of them intercepted, not this time. Iran had launched 94 ballistic missiles in the opening salvo. Of those, Israeli and American-supported defenses intercepted 71. 23 got through. Of those 23, 14 struck military or infrastructure targets, and 9 hit residential areas. The death toll in the first 6 hours was 67 Israeli civilians and 12 soldiers. The port of Haifa sustained significant damage. A fuel depot in Ashdod burned for 11 hours. A neighborhood in Rehovot, a city of 250,000 people south of Tel Aviv, had 3 apartment buildings reduced to rubble. The images from Rehovot looked like Beirut. They looked like Gaza. And in Israel, that comparison was not made lightly. Israel's response was not measured.
It was overwhelming.
Within 90 minutes of the first Iranian missiles landing, the Israeli Air Force had F-35I Adir fighters, their most advanced variant of the stealth jet, airborne and en route to targets inside Iran. The strike package was massive, 64 aircraft in total, supported by aerial refueling tankers and electronic warfare jets. Their targets were not symbolic. They were existential, from Iran's perspective.
Natanz. Fordow. The uranium enrichment facility buried 90 meters underground in the mountains near Qom.
The Parchin military complex. The Imam Ali missile base near Kermanshah. The strikes on Natanz and Fordow were the ones that changed everything. Israel had attempted to destroy Iran's nuclear program before, in the shadows, through Stuxnet, through the assassination of nuclear scientists, through covert sabotage. But this was direct.
This was bombs.
Specifically, it was the GBU-28 bunker buster, the 5,000-pound penetrating weapon that Israel had quietly acquired from the United States over the previous decade, combined with their own MPR-500 munitions. Fordow, the facility that Iranian officials had long claimed was invulnerable to air attack because of its depth, was hit by 8 penetrating munitions in a coordinated sequence designed to collapse the underground chambers. Israeli military spokesman would later claim the facility was severely damaged. Iranian officials denied any damage to the centrifuges. The truth, as always in warfare, was somewhere between those two statements and probably closer to the Israeli account. Iran's air defenses were not passive. They fired 47 surface-to-air missiles at the incoming Israeli strike packages. They shot down 3 Israeli aircraft, 2 F-35s and 1 F-16I, and damaged 4 others. The 3 pilots from the downed aircraft were recovered, 2 by Israeli search and rescue operations and 1 who was captured by Iranian forces. That captured pilot became, instantly, one of the most significant diplomatic cards in the entire conflict. Now the war had multiple fronts, and the world was watching all of them simultaneously. In the Strait of Hormuz, Iranian Revolutionary Guard naval forces deployed a swarm of 34 fast attack boats against a commercial tanker convoy, forcing the convoy to scatter and prompting the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group to move into a defensive posture. Iranian Kilo-class submarines were detected by American P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, moving into positions that threatened both commercial shipping lanes and the carrier group itself. The Lincoln launched F/A-18 Super Hornets in a Shoah force overflight that came within 12 miles of Iranian territorial waters. The message was clear. The response from Tehran was equally clear. 2 Iranian anti-ship missiles were fired at the carrier group from shore-based launchers. Both were intercepted by USS Arleigh Burke-class destroyers using SM-6 missiles. No American ships were hit. But the fact that Iran had fired at an American carrier for the first time in history was a threshold that had never been crossed before. In Lebanon, Hezbollah launched what military analysts described as their largest single-day barrage of the entire conflict, 1,247 rockets and missiles fired into northern Israel over a 14-hour period. Iron Dome batteries intercepted 891 of them. The remaining 356 caused damage across 23 communities, killing 41 people and wounding 319. Israeli artillery responded with 6 hours of continuous fire into southern Lebanon. Israeli ground forces, already positioned along the border, crossed into Lebanese territory at 3 points simultaneously. The fighting in the border villages was close and brutal, infantry against infantry, house to house, with Hezbollah fighters using the tunnel networks they had spent years building. In 48 hours of ground combat, Israel lost 28 soldiers. Hezbollah losses were estimated at 340 fighters. Lebanese civilian casualties in the border zone reached 780 in those same 48 hours. In the capitals of the world, the phones never stopped ringing. Putin called Netanyahu. The call lasted 22 minutes. The Kremlin's readout was characteristically vague, a frank exchange of views, but 3 sources in the Israeli government described the conversation as a warning. Russia had interests in Syria, Russian military personnel were present in the region, and Israel needed to be careful about strikes that might endanger them. Putin did not condemn Iran. He did not support Israel. He played the role he has perfected over 2 decades of foreign policy, the indispensable broker who maintains relationships with all sides and is therefore constrained by none of them.
Russia had sold Iran the S-300 air defense systems that were now being used against Israeli aircraft. That fact was not mentioned in the Kremlin readout. Xi Jinping's position was more complex and more economically revealing. China imports 14% of its oil from Iran. China has a 25-year strategic partnership agreement with Tehran signed in 2021. China also has $400 billion in trade with the United States and has no interest in a regional war that disrupts global supply chains. She made 3 phone calls in the first 48 hours, to the Iranian president, to the European Union's foreign policy chief, and to the UN Secretary General. He did not call Trump. He did not call Netanyahu. That choice, deliberate, calculated, said everything about where Beijing saw its interests. China wanted to be the peacemaker, the adult in the room, the power that could claim credit for de-escalation while quietly benefiting from American distraction and European anxiety. The European response was, predictably, a call for immediate de-escalation and a return to diplomatic channels, a statement so anodyne and so disconnected from the reality on the ground that it was almost immediately forgotten by everyone except the diplomats who issued it. France's foreign minister flew to Beirut and was told, politely but firmly, that there was nothing to negotiate while Israeli forces were on Lebanese soil. Germany froze a small arms export license. The UK dispatched a Royal Navy frigate to the eastern Mediterranean, more as a signal of solidarity with the United States than as a meaningful military contribution. Saudi Arabia's reaction was the most fascinating of all, and the one that received the least coverage. Riyadh had been quietly negotiating its own normalization agreement with Israel before the war erupted, a deal that would have reshaped the entire Middle East strategic architecture. That deal was now dead, at least temporarily. But Saudi Arabia had no love for Iran. The two countries are rivals for regional dominance, divided by religion, by ethnicity, by oil market interests, and by decades of proxy conflict in Yemen, Iraq, and Lebanon. Saudi Arabia was not mourning Iranian missile strikes on Israel. Saudi Arabia was watching, calculating, and quietly ensuring that its own Patriot batteries were fully operational and that its American security guarantees were still firmly in place. How far is Tehran actually willing to go? That's the question that kept every intelligence analyst in Washington up at night. Because there's a version of this where Iran has already played its strongest cards, the ballistic missile barrage, the Hormuz threat, the Hezbollah ground campaign, and is now looking for a face-saving off-ramp. And there's another version where the strikes on Natanz and Fordow have created a domestic political situation inside Iran where backing down is impossible, where the regime's survival depends on demonstrating that it can absorb punishment and continue fighting. Those two versions of Iran lead to very different outcomes. And the terrifying truth is that outside analysts, and possibly even Iran's own leadership, weren't entirely sure which version was real. Back in Washington, the National Security Council was meeting in what one participant later described as a sustained state of controlled panic. The military options on the table ranged from targeted strikes on Iranian missile launch sites, a relatively limited operation, to a comprehensive air campaign designed to degrade Iran's military capabilities across multiple domains simultaneously. Trump was reportedly drawn to the more aggressive option. His military advisors were more cautious, not because they doubted American capability, but because they understood the second and third order consequences. Striking Iran comprehensively meant a regional war. A regional war meant the Strait of Hormuz closed. The strait closed meant oil at $200 a barrel. Oil at $200 a barrel meant a global recession. And a global recession, in an election cycle, meant political consequences that even the most hawkish advisor had to weigh. There's something almost unbearably familiar about this moment for Americans who lived through the lead-up to Iraq in 2002, or the Iranian hostage crisis in 1979, or the Cuban Missile Crisis briefings that their parents and grandparents remember watching on black and white television. That feeling of watching a situation accelerate beyond the control of any single actor, of realizing that the mechanisms designed to prevent catastrophe, diplomacy, deterrence, back-channel communication, are straining under pressures they were never quite designed to handle. That feeling of wondering whether the adults in the room are actually in control, or whether they're managing the appearance of control while the situation manages itself. The ground war in Lebanon was now in its 7th day. Israeli forces had pushed 8 kilometers into Lebanese territory.
Hezbollah was fighting a disciplined defensive withdrawal, bleeding Israeli units at every choke point, using the terrain and the tunnel networks with the expertise of an organization that had been preparing for this specific war for 15 years. The Israeli Air Force was flying 200 sorties a day. The civilian population of southern Lebanon, those who hadn't already fled, was trapped between two armies. The UN humanitarian coordinator described the situation as catastrophic. The word had been used so many times in so many conflicts that it had almost lost its meaning, but the numbers behind it hadn't. 340,000 displaced Lebanese. 23 hospitals non-functional. 4 days of food supplies remaining entire. A city of 60,000 people running out of everything simultaneously. In Tehran, the mood was complicated. The state television was broadcasting images of the Israeli aircraft losses, the downed F-35s, on continuous loop. The regime was framing the conflict as a historic victory, proof that Iran could stand against the Zionist entity and its American patron. But in the streets of North Tehran, in the neighborhoods where the educated middle class lived, in the university districts, there was a different calculation being made. The strikes on Natanz and Fordow had been presented by the regime as failures of Israeli intelligence, as attacks that caused minimal damage. But people with access to satellite imagery and foreign news sources knew better. And they were asking themselves the same question that Iranians have been asking since 1979: how much more of this can the country absorb before something fundamental breaks? Is the real architect of this war? That's a question worth sitting with, because the easy answers Iran, Israel, America all contain pieces of the truth and none of the whole truth. Iran built and funded Hezbollah. Israel chose to respond to Hezbollah's provocations with a ground campaign rather than a negotiated arrangement. The United States provided weapons and diplomatic cover while insisting it wasn't a party to the conflict. Russia and China benefited from Western distraction. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states watched their Iranian rival bleed while making quiet calculations about their own security. There is no single villain in this story. There is a system, a regional order, or rather a regional disorder, that has been generating conflict for 70 years, and the latest eruption of that disorder is what we're watching now. On the 9th day of the war, something happened that hadn't happened in any of the previous rounds of Iran-Israel confrontation. A ballistic missile, an Iranian Zulfiqar, with a range of 700 kilometers and a 450-kilogram warhead, struck the Israeli Air Force base at Nevatim in the Negev Desert. Nevatim is the home of Israel's F-35 fleet. The strike killed 9 Israeli Air Force personnel and destroyed 4 aircraft on the ground. It was the deepest penetration of Israeli territory by an Iranian missile in the entire conflict, and it demonstrated something that Israeli and American planners had hoped the Arrow 3 system would prevent: that Iran had enough missiles, fired in enough configurations, to saturate Israeli defenses and get through. Israel's cabinet met for 6 hours after the Nevatim strike. The discussion, according to multiple accounts, included for the first time explicit consideration of options that had never previously been on the table in any official forum. The word nuclear was not used. But the concept it represents, the idea that Israel has capabilities it has never acknowledged and has never used, was present in the room in the way that unspeakable things are sometimes present in rooms, not spoken, but felt by everyone. The United States moved the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group from the eastern Mediterranean to a position 200 miles west of the Israeli coast. The move was described as repositioning for enhanced defensive support. It was also, unmistakably, a signal to Tehran: if you escalate further, you are not fighting Israel alone. You are fighting us. Whether that signal would be enough, whether deterrence, which had already failed once when Iran launched its first missiles, could be re-established, was the question that no one in Washington could answer with confidence. The world is sitting at a threshold right now that it has not sat at since the Cold War's most dangerous moments. Not because any single actor wants a global conflict, but because the mechanisms that prevent escalation, deterrence, diplomacy, shared economic interest, are all under strain simultaneously, and because the actors involved have domestic political pressures that make compromise look like weakness and confrontation look like strength. Iran cannot back down without appearing to surrender. Israel cannot stop without appearing to accept vulnerability. The United States cannot disengage without appearing to abandon its ally. And the rest of the world, Russia, China, Europe, the Gulf states is watching, calculating, and hoping that someone else makes the decision that stops this before it becomes something that can't be stopped.
The second front is open. The missiles are flying. The ships are at battle stations.
And somewhere in the back channels, through Oman, through Qatar, through the quiet intermediaries who do the work that diplomats can't do publicly, someone is trying to find the phrase, the formula, the face-saving arrangement that lets everyone step back from the edge without anyone having to admit they blinked.
Whether they find it in time is the only question that matters right now. And I genuinely don't know the answer. I'm not sure anyone does.
What I do know is that the warning Tehran sent to Trump, that quiet, devastating message delivered in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, was not the beginning of this story. It was the moment when a story that had been building for decades finally arrived at the place where it could no longer be managed, deferred, or ignored.
The second front is open. And the world is holding its breath. Where do you think this goes from here?